So welcome, everyone. Glad to have you here today to join us for this inaugural Distinguished Speakers Series. And I can't think of a better way to kick this off than with the panelists that we have joining with us today. The speaker series was designed to provide both our local residents here in Sierra Vista an opportunity to meet and discuss important issues of the day, as well as to give us an opportunity to reach out to other people around the world with this online presentation of our guests today. So let's start right into this and let me introduce our speakers and our discussion topic for today. Today's topic is a panel discussion on the future of U.S.-China relations. And we have two wonderful panelists who are joining us for today's panel. Our first panelist is Senator Bill Cassidy. Dr. Bill Cassidy is the senior United States Senator for Louisiana. Senator Cassidy grew up in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and attended Louisiana State University for undergraduate studies and medical school. In 1990, he joined the LSU Medical School faculty, teaching medical students and residents at the Earl K. Long Hospital, a hospital for the uninsured. In 2006, Senator Cassidy was elected to the Louisiana State Senate, and in 2008, he was elected to the United States House of Representatives to represent Louisiana's 6th Congressional District. In 2014, he was first elected to the U.S. Senate, and he serves on the Finance Committee, the Health, Education, Labor and Pensions Committee, or HELP Committee, the Energy and Natural Resources Committee, and the Veterans Affairs Committee. Following his successful efforts to lower the cost of healthcare, secure coastal restoration projects to protect Louisiana families from natural disasters, reform our nation's mental health system, and secure many other legislative accomplishments, Senator Cassidy was reelected in 2020 to a second term in the U.S. Senate. In 2023, Senator Cassidy became the ranking member of the Senate Help Committee, and he is the first physician to sit as Help ranking member or chairman since 1933, when it was called the Education and Labor Committee. Recently, Senator Cassidy was in the news when I read through the president's introduction of his artificial intelligence and data protection ideas going on, where he has introduced several bills within the Senate related to online data privacy and data protection, to include legislation co-sponsored with Senators Elizabeth Warren and Marco Rubio to protect the data of military service members from enemies such as China and Russia, a topic that is certainly aligned with our college's program in intelligence and information operations. Senator Cassidy, we'd like to welcome you to our college.
Thank you. I'm pleased to be with you.
Good to be here. And I apologize that I am a frozen picture, I think, on your screen, but I think that's a website issue on mine end. Our second panelist is equally well-versed for this topic today. It's Professor Danielle Tirone. Professor Tirone serves as an associate professor of political science at Louisiana State University. He earned his PhD in political science at the University of Pittsburgh, and his dissertation was titled Politics and the Efficacy of Humanitarian Aid. Professor Tirone's research focuses on issues related to international relations, including the subfields of international political economy and conflict processes, and has been published in leading academic journals such as International Organization, American Journal of Political Science, Journal of Conflict Resolution, and Journal of Politics. In addition to research and teaching, Professor Tirone serves as the Vice President of the Faculty Senate at Louisiana State University, a difficult job indeed. Welcome to the college, Professor Tirone.
Thank you, Dean Packard. It's a pleasure to be with you, the Senator, and Professor Nurullayev today.
Thank you. Our panel moderator today is our own Professor Dmitriy Nurullayev. Professor Nurullayev is Assistant Professor of Government at the College of Applied Science and Technology at the University of Arizona. Before joining the faculty at the University of Arizona, Dmitriy held a postdoctorate fellowship at the Fletcher School at Tufts University and a pre-doctoral fellowship at the Davis Center at Harvard University. He recently published a paper with Mihaela Papa in Global Studies Quarterly titled Bloc Politics at the UN, How Other States Behave When the United States and China and Russia Disagree. Dr. Nurullayev earned his MA and PhD in political science at Louisiana State University and an MPhil in international relations at the University of Cambridge. Today's panel will be conducted in two parts. First, Professor Nurullayev will lead a panel discussion with our two panelists, and then following the panel, we will take a short refreshment break. For those of you here in Sierra Vista, I will come join you shortly in that room, and we will partake of a break there. I'm sorry, for those of you online, you'll have to take a break in your own spaces and rejoin us for the second half, where anyone who is interested can join a hybrid community discussion with online and in-person guests on the topic of today. I would now like to turn the panel over to Professor Nurullayev to start today's discussion. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Dean Packard, for the introductions. Thank you, Senator Cassidy, for graciously making time in your busy schedule to join us today. I actually met Senator Cassidy walking my dog near LSU one day, and I appreciate that we have stayed in touch, and I appreciate that you were willing to join our panel today. I'm also thankful to Professor Daniel Tirone for joining our conversation today. Professor Tirone served as an advisor on my graduate committee, and I certainly owe him an immense amount of debt for my own professional accomplishments. So thank you, gentlemen, for your willingness to join our conversation today. So let's just get started. I'm going to ask a broad question. I will allow each of you to whatever amount of time you wish to answer that question. I have some follow-up questions after that. And if time allows, I may be able to ask you a few questions that are posed to us by the audience. The first question is, in your view, what is the biggest challenge for U.S.-China relations today? And we will start with Senator Cassidy.
Well, the biggest challenge is, how do we confront a rising power in a way in which we manage to peacefully coexist? Now, I think in order to understand that, at least in my own thinking, when I started to think about this, I went to a book written, The Rise and Fall of Great Powers by Paul Kennedy, from around 1988-89. And in that, he points out that there is I don't know, I forget if he used the word or not, but there's a tight statistical correlation, an R square that's, very significant, between a country's energy use, a country's economic growth, and a country's investment in military strength. And that it isn't just the rise of a country, it is the relative rise of one country versus many others. Now, I think if Professor Kennedy were writing that book again today, he would put a fourth factor, and that fourth factor would be, at least in the case of China, the amount of emissions that it is producing. Now, I go through this because I'm also, if you will, presaging the strategy I think the United States can have. So if we look at this, when China ascended to WTO in 2020, I think, or whenever it did, 2020, I think, its economic growth went fantastic. It goes from 20th or 19th in the world in manufacturing to far away number one. From GDP way back here to number two in the world, by some measures number one. Its military goes from way back here to second only to the US, and its emissions go from way back here to producing 1/3 of the greenhouse gas emissions worldwide. Now, what is our challenge? First, to recognize that it is the trade that they have had, the asymmetric trade pattern that they've had with the US and others, that have fueled their economic growth. That this fueling of their economic growth is correlated quite tightly with their rise in military strength. By the way, with also their hegemony through Belt and Road and other measures. And it has also contributed to climbing emissions. Even as the US emissions have gone down, theirs have more than compensated for ours. And now we have more greenhouse gas emissions than ever. So what is our challenge? Our challenge is to understand this relationship and begin to unwind the economic strength that we have contributed to, that has allowed China to grow in a manner that it can fund its military and its foreign policy hegemony, and to do it, by the way, in a way which doesn't provoke war, but rather forces China to adhere to international norms, rule of law, and if you will, makes the economic gain less asymmetric and more symmetrical between the two countries. Got a lot in there, Dmitry, but you asked me a big question.
Thank you, Senator Cassidy, for that insightful comment. Professor Tirone, do you wish to add to that?
Yeah, no, I'd love to. And I'm going to piggyback off of a bit of what the senator introduced, particularly towards the end of his comments. I'm going to start by saying that I think sort of the most immediate challenge to the relationship is going to be the risk of an unintentional escalation. I'm pretty concerned about the Chinese provocations around the U.S. military in the South China Sea, and the option here, or the opportunity for an unintentional escalation, such as a collision, something that is viewed as provocative, and which then sets off perhaps some reciprocal process between the states, I think is an unintended way we can end up in a conflict nobody wants. And so hopefully we are able to avoid that. I think secondarily, the question of Taiwan is going to be fairly pressing. That's in a way that we can get into a conflict of choice, where either state, or particularly with the onus on China, because presumably they'd be the first actor, would take a step to reclaim Taiwan for themselves and have control over the territory. And of course, the U.S. has indications, even with the policy of strategic ambiguity, that we would presumably assist Taiwan in that case. And then you're in a great power war. And once you're in that scenario, I don't think anyone anticipates how it will turn out, but we all know that it would be incredibly destructive and costly. Turning to sort of a longer term, and the senator had referenced here sort of the rule of law and how do these countries coexist. As an international relations scholar, right, and I must admit that I come from the IR field, so I'm not an expert on China's domestic politics. So when I'm going to speak largely from a perspective of structure and the structure of the international system. One of the things that's really caught my attention and giving me some concern is this deterioration of the liberal rules-based order that's been in place since the end of World War II. The United States worked with our partners at Bretton Woods to institute institutions such as the IMF and the World Bank. We worked on the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and really created a global structure that through the Cold War aligned the Western countries, created common interests, allowed for economic growth based on liberal democracy, respect for human rights and trade. And then in the post-World War or post-Cold War environment, right, expanded to include the non-aligned countries and the countries that had previously been under the umbrella of the Soviet Union, and has led to incredible gains within China, within India, and within a lot of these countries that had previously been excluded from that process. And this has been really to the advantage of the United States. The United States has been a leading figure here. We have outsized influence a lot of these institutions that undergird the democratic, liberal order. And it is the institutions that really serve our interests, even though these institutions constrain our policy choices on occasion, keeping the United States maybe from its most preferred option. The investment in the system has made it worth it. And particularly one of the things I'm looking at here is the financial system. And I'm sure this will come up as we go along, right? But the strength of the US dollar, the omnipresence of the US dollar in global finance, global reserve currencies, things like this, gives the US tremendous advantages that we usually don't think about when we think about other traditional factors such as economic size, military size, landmass size, things like this. And so it's for that reason that as I look at what appears to be a growing cleavage in the liberal rules-based order, that's been coming on for some time now, and we can get into the reasons for this perhaps a little bit later. But as you look at what China is trying to do to create an alternative to the rules-based order, right? If we think about the rules-based order, we think about it as a focal point in the language of political science, right? And there's a network effect. If everybody is bought in, it becomes really difficult to create an alternative because the incentive for doing so just isn't there. And there's real costs for exiting the system that everyone subscribes to, right? I mean, this is one of the issues. One of the papers I was reading as I was preparing for this was talking about when Google tried to create Google Plus and just couldn't break through Facebook's control of social media markets because nobody was looking for an alternative and it's hard to introduce one. As we have seen over the last few years, there is now a bit of a cleavage. What China is clearly trying to do is create an alternative to the rules-based order through their alliances with Iran, through their alliances with Russia, through their support of the actions of those states, through creation of institutions such as the Asia Infrastructure Development Bank, which is an alternative to the World Bank and World Bank financing, and perhaps also stepping in as they're doing in Belt and Road with addressing some of the issues that traditionally have fallen under the purview of the IMF. If we see a schism where essentially we now have bifurcation of the international system as we did under the Cold War. And we now see sort of an autocratic alliance that is outside of the traditional system, and then Western liberal democracies which still inhabit this rules-based order. I think that is really going to be one of the challenges to the United States. How do you navigate that? Because it's really going to erode American hegemony in a way we haven't seen since before the Cold War. And that is where I think it is most likely that you may see some deterioration in relations as each side now tries to remain dominant in its own domain. And you now see consistent provocations between the two. You may see a bifurcation in the trade system where, trade now only occurs within these blocks, and essentially getting to a system like we saw much in the Cold War, which of course, we sustained, but was very fraught and detrimental to overall global relations. So as I sort of look down and see the evolution of BRICS Plus and things like this, that's one of the things that I think is going to be the pressing mid to long-term challenge for the US, is how to navigate that relationship.
Thank you, Professor Tirone. So building off of the comments made by you and Senator Cassidy, my following question kind of has two parts to it. One is, how can the United States and China escape the Thucydides trap, this understanding that in international relations that a rising power and a sitting hegemon often will go to war with one another? The conditions for that war have changed, right? We've never had such a situation under the presence of nuclear weapons, really, with a clear sitting hegemon and a clear challenger, especially if you assume that the Cold War was more or less bipolar situation. So how do we avoid that trap? Because even if we do want to counter China, we certainly do not wish for a unrestricted, unlimited conflict with China. And building off of what you just said earlier, when it comes to the challenge to the liberal international order led by the United States, this challenge, that comes from China, Russia, through some of their informal alliances like the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. BRICS has now admitted 6 more members: Iran, Saudi Arabia, Argentina, Egypt, and I'm missing a couple there. But what's interesting is that this alliance is not fully autocratic or democratic. It has a combination of democracies and autocracies. And should we be concerned? So yeah, I'll stop my question there. But the major point that I'd like you to address is, how do we avoid all-out conflict with China as a result of their rise and challenge to the international order?
Daniel, you want to go first, man? Or you want me to?
I'll defer to the senator, and I'll be happy to follow up.
Sounds great. So let's go back to, I told you I was going to presage any solution I would have. And that is that there is a tight statistical correlation between economic growth, in this case also greenhouse gas emissions, military strength, and energy use. Now, the strategy that I am proposing, and have just introduced legislation, was to put in what we call a foreign pollution fee, or which others may call a carbon border adjustment mechanism. We can look at the products that China produces, and they produce them with a much greater greenhouse gas emission profile than does the United States and Western Europe. And we, in a sense, have been giving them a free pass to do that. It costs a lot of money to control greenhouse gas emissions. China, by not controlling those emissions and using coal instead of nuclear or natural gas, is again accounting for 1/3 of the world's greenhouse gas emissions, number one. But number two, the avoided cost of controlling those emissions makes it cheaper to manufacture in China, which has attracted manufacturing from around the world, which fuels their economy, which one more time, fueling their economy has allowed them to put out Belt and Road, string of pearls, as well as their military might. Now, if all of a sudden they have to pay a fee, a tariff, roughly commensurate with what they're not paying, with the avoided cost of controlling their emissions, it somewhat equalizes the cost of doing business, of manufacturing in the United States versus China, or maybe China versus Germany. I'll stick with the United States. I think we're a better example. That will contribute to this trend we're seeing of the reindustrialization of the United States. It contributes to our relative rise as an economy and their relative decline as an economy. The less money they have to spend upon their military and upon Belt and Road, et cetera, the less money they have to spend, the less they begin to relatively decrease. Now, we're not firing a shot, but we're decreasing their military readiness. You've seen this a little bit already. They have cut the size of their standing army. They don't have unlimited resources by which to promote that. They have begun to scale back their Belt and Road Initiative, recognizing, among other things, they have $1 trillion of outstanding loans, 70% roughly going to countries which are in economic distress. So no longer can they just write a blank check, not worried about the loss. And as they relatively decrease and we relatively increase, I think it becomes less likely they will embark upon military action. One, it would further damage their economy. But two, they are going to be less likely to be able to withstand. Oh, and did I mention, the only way they get out of this tariff is if they begin to control their greenhouse gas emissions. That has a secondary benefit. Obviously, we as a world wish to control those emissions. It also directly benefits the U.S. 25% of sulfate in the air in California is blowing over the Pacific from China. So our foreign pollution fee, which is going to be a fee on the avoided cost of controlling greenhouse gas emissions, will increase the cost of manufacturing in China, therefore increase the likelihood that someone instead sets up in the United States, relatively weakening their economy, relatively increasing ours, and therefore the productive capacity relatively declining to support their military, relatively contributing to increased support for ours and other things, which hopefully brings back their retreat from the brink because they're more concerned about providing Social Security for a rapidly aging population, healthcare for a rapidly aging population, and less about stealing our IP and building another aircraft carrier.
Thank you, Senator. Professor Tirone.
Yeah, I mean, I think as we navigate this relationship moving forward, the most important thing the United States can do is keep a sense of perspective on this relationship. There are some signals, and again, I'm not an expert on domestic Chinese politics, but I'm relying on folks who are, that, China has a number of domestic challenges, and the senator just pointed out some: an aging population, the desire of these populations for increased standards of living and things of that nature. There is tremendous skepticism that they're going to be able to keep up the rate of growth that they've achieved. And in fact, there's some who have even gone so far as to argue, and I'm not making this argument myself, but it is out there, that they may undergo some sort of deflationary spiral. In fact, they're going to see as their economy ages, as they are no longer able to engage in the type of massive public project spendings that have really been boosting their economy, that there's going to be some economic decline and retrenchment that may get them back to a more natural level, but is going to feel like a loss to the country because they have become accustomed to tremendously high levels of growth. And there's some assumption when you've done that for long enough, it's going to continue. But as the economists say, things that can't continue forever stop. Right. And so I think what we need to do is sort of maintain a sense of perspective and go back maybe even to the 80s and the 90s when there was another emerging power in Asia, right? Japan. And there was a lot of concern that, Japan is going to overtake the US as a leading global economy, and they're going to be the regional hegemon. And then they have a lost decade in the 1990s and then get whammed with a financial crisis in the 2000s from which they haven't, now they're recovering, but it's certainly set them back and have made sort of these concerns about Japan as an emerging rival to the United States in retrospect look a bit overstated. Right. And I think this is going to be the concern with China, is keeping a sense of perspective, being attuned to their future trajectory, making sure that we don't get provoked into an overreaction, either through misunderstanding or deliberate policy. And, recognizing that we are, at least at this point in time, operating from the position of strength. Our economy is bigger. We are the second largest manufacturing power in the world. We have the largest military in the world, and we have tremendous financial advantages that they do not have. And so I think recognizing our strengths, recognizing the challenges that they are navigating as they're going through the immediate and near-term future, being in a position to assist them, if they do encounter these challenges. And I think it's important to keep them close, right? We haven't seen a decline in cross-border trade between the United States and China, which I think is ultimately a good thing. I mean, if you subscribe to liberal arguments of interdependence, and I know there are challenges to that, right? Weaponized interdependence, Farrell and Newman, and things along those lines. But in this case, I think it's good to maintain vested interests in the maintenance of each other's economy. What we are seeing is that the pattern of trade is changing. So the goods that were subject to tariffs under the Trump administration have declined. And what we've seen is significant declines in aircraft. We've seen significant declines in automobiles, right? But those have been offset by growth in other areas of exports of the United States to China, such as agricultural products, soybeans, and the like, right? And I think maintaining this mutual interest, maintaining economic growth, recognizing that they're going to have incentives that they're reacting to internationally, domestically, recognizing their aspirations, reducing our vulnerability in some areas, such as increasing our own independence in the production of microprocessors, as the CHIPS Act is going to do, making sure we reduce our vulnerability, be attentive to the needs of them as a rival, but also not presume that we are on this trajectory where conflict is inevitable, because I don't think it has to be unless we set the conditions in place that make it such, right? And so if we can be attentive to this, if we can recognize the situation and be reasonable about it, right? There's any number of different ways it can go, but that also includes an opportunity for sort of mutual and peaceful coexistence.
Thank you, Professor Tirone. My next question, I mean, you guys kind of answered at least half of this one. By the way, before I ask my next question, I just want to quickly point out that we have almost over 100 people zooming in live into this webinar. There's also some individuals who are watching this sort of in person. We have an auditorium here where this is being streamed, and there's more than one person there, but it's not being accounted in the total tally by Zoom. So I'm very grateful to all of our audience who showed up, and want to encourage you all to submit your questions. If you have any questions, please feel free to use the chat option to submit your questions. And if there's an opportunity, I will do my best to pose your questions to our panelists at the end of our discussion. With that, my next question is, so the first portion of that question was, what areas, or are there areas in which the United States should take a more pointed, a stronger stance towards China? And I feel that you guys have really addressed that, unless you want to add something to that. Maybe the more interesting question is, are there areas where maybe we are overreacting? Are there areas in which the United States should consider being more accommodating towards China?
Well, I'll continue the sequence of going first, Daniel. By the way, when all this is over, you got to tell me why you're both a Buffalo Bills fan and an LSU fan, but that'll be later. Let me just first go a little bit where we could be stronger. I want to build upon that which we're doing with our foreign pollution fee. Others would call it a carbon border adjustment mechanism. If the U.S. partners with like-minded countries, the EU, UK, Australia, South Korea, Japan, etc., we will have a voting bloc, which might be a minority of the world's population, but it is a majority of the value add. And we can set up the rules that if a country like Vietnam wishes to sell within there, that they would adopt Western environmental standards, not Chinese environmental standards. So right now, Vietnam outcompetes China by having a lower cost of manufacturing, which in this case means that they are even less concerned about the environment than is China. But if you say, wait a second, in order to be able to bring in your goods tariff-free to the US, UK, Japan, China, etc., you've got to adopt Western environmental standards, then they're going to outcompete China by being more compliant with environmental standards. We set this up as a magnet just because our market is so big and so value rich that a country like Vietnam or India would adopt our standards. Therefore, we achieve lower greenhouse gas emissions, but we strengthen the alliance, the attachment of other countries to I'm going to say the West, but it includes Japan, Australia, New Zealand, etc. So South Korea. So I do think that we can become stronger like that. Now, what about places where we're overreacting? I think it's a little bit of a wild card. Xi Jinping has such control over that country that you don't know what they are willing to do. Right now, they're clearly inhibiting economic growth with their desire for CCP to maintain control. When I recently went to China, I was with a group of 5 senators total, and we were the first legislative congressional delegation to meet with Xi Jinping in 5 years. And we met with Chinese businessmen, we met with South Korean businessmen in Seoul, et cetera. And there is a general, if their economic strategy is what is called dual circulation, promoting internal consumption and promoting exports, both are suffering. Exports are suffering because they've become so capricious with which companies are going to subsidize, which they're going to punish. You don't understand why. That they become so capricious that, as one businessman said, we'll continue to invest, but only with those investments which are derived internally from our business in China. We're not going to bring money external to China into China to invest, because they're too capricious in terms of how they favor one business versus another. The perception, one of the businessmen in Seoul said, when you're in China, you're not just competing against other businesses, you're competing against the Communist Chinese Party. That interjects uncertainty, and we don't know if we want to be there. So I think that Xi Jinping's focus upon preserving the role of the CCP and his willingness to sacrifice any other things, I don't quite know what to expect. Japan, I have a sense. Canada, I have a sense. Mexico, you have a sense. Xi Jinping, he can decide that he wants to destroy their economy to go after Taiwan, and no one can contradict him. And the absence of somebody who can contradict means that I don't really know if we can see the future.
Sounds awfully familiar to another situation unfolding currently with a president who clearly has decided to put military outcome above all else at the expense of his own, military capability and economic capability. I'm obviously talking about the Russian president. Professor Tirone, would you like to add to Senator Cassidy's remarks?
No, I would, and I think the senator is spot on. I think more cooperation is really the requirement here, and I think the more that we can integrate China, or at least continue the current level of integration, right, in this incentive they have to withdraw, is important, because it is difficult to predict how they're going to respond. And the political science literature, right, certainly says that even autocrats have a domestic audience to whom they are responsive. So I think the question is going to be, can we create conditions where the domestic audience that surrounds Xi Jinping understand his individual incentives, but we can create a competing set of incentives for future prosperity, for future economic growth, right, that will allow them to maintain either the position within government that they have achieved, or lifestyles that they have realized, and so sort of target the individuals surrounding him, because one individual can be unpredictable, but hopefully we can have a little more leverage over the the collection of a group. Now, having said that, one of the things I think where we need to be a little more accommodating is in the area of economic sanctions. The United States has really used sanctions fairly widely, particularly in the last 10 years, and particularly against Russia and Iran. And one of the things driving this sort of cleavage between the US and these other states is the use of sanctions and the incentives it creates for the creation of an alternative system, and particularly a renminbi oriented system. Now, if China is able to increase the viability of the renminbi, it's going to get back to the same situation the senator was sort of referencing a little bit earlier, where they will have more ability to deficit finance military spending, for example, through the issuance of government debt and things like this, whereas right now they're more constrained due to the presence of the U.S. dollar, right, and the ultimate role of the dollar as a reserve currency and things like that. Should that diminish, then we're going to have a harder time keeping them in the system, keeping them close, keeping them within the rules that we've established and within these institutions that have served us so well over the last 70 years. And one of the things, and I'm relying here on the work of Daniel McDowell, who recently had a great book that just came out on this, is clearly our use of sanctions against targeted states and targeted, either states that whom we have targeted or find themselves likely to be targets, that then incentivizes this creation of an alternative. Now, an alternative is difficult to create. You can't just make one up overnight. China would be the clear focal point for this. There's reasons why it's not automatic that they will be. But the more that we abuse sort of this privilege that we have through our, through the supremacy of the dollar and the institutions with which we manage it, the more that we can exercise it in the short term, but we'll deny ourselves that option in the long term and erode our position in the overall economy and in the overall economic system. And so I think that's sort of one area where a little bit of restraint will go a long way in the maintenance of a system that much more broadly serves our interests.
And so, Dmitry, if I can comment, if I can piggyback. One, I think that the fact that Xi Jinping backed off on his COVID lockdown is an example of what Daniel is saying about an internal audience. Young people went crazy. They were just sick of it. And so that kind of set of protest obviously was able to influence him. Now, kind of related to that, there's a 25% or so unemployment rate among young people. People are graduating from college and 1 out of 4 is uninsured. Is unemployed. And so what kind of pushback will that have on him in terms of having to create domestic economic opportunity, which right now he's been willing to sacrifice? So I just want to echo what he says. I also want to kind of piggyback slight disagreement and then a kind of take off on that disagreement. The current administration wishes to de-risk but not decouple, to maintain that relationship. And Gina Raimondo has used, Commerce Secretary has used the term high fence, small yard. A very small number of things which we would not trade, but put a really high fence around that. Advanced computer chips are an example of that. Now, you can argue that China is going to be able to come up with their own advanced computer chips. And they probably can, but they'll still put them 4 or 5 years behind some of the stuff that we're attempting to do with AI, et cetera. So there may be an advantage of having that running start. And then lastly, a book that was very influential for me, but I think kind of goes along with Professor Tirone's kind of a point. The current ambassador from Australia to the United States, The Avoidable War. He speaks about the need to cooperate, compete, and confront China. In my own mind, I put limit confrontation. So there's going to be some areas we have to cooperate. Ideally, we'd cooperate about bringing a peaceful resolution to the Ukrainian-Russian war. Ideally, we'd cooperate in terms of lowering greenhouse gas emissions. And I think that my foreign pollution fee idea is one way to get at that. Ideally, we'd cooperate on decreasing the amount of fentanyl flowing into our country. We're going to compete around the world, whether it is foreign policy initiatives, what we're doing in terms of, building infrastructure to the third world versus what Belt and Road is about. That would be an example of that competition. But we want to limit the confrontation. We're going to have some confrontation. The South China Sea has already been raised. Taiwan is another. There's going to be some confrontation. You don't want competition to spill over into confrontation. You want confrontation to be narrowly circumscribed, guardrails around that, so that we are less likely to stumble into something. At the outset, it was talked about near collisions in space, in airspace, or on the ocean. So I like that paradigm, and I think I'm seeing the administration adopt that paradigm of collaborate, compete, and confront, avoid confrontation.
Thank you so much, Senator. My next question is a bit more related to an ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine. As Russia and Ukraine continue their military confrontation, well, I think the more appropriate word is actually war. How does this impact, in your view, the dynamic between Russia and China. I think a lot has been said about China turning into Russia's big brother rather than Russia being China's big brother, as it was referred to in the past historically. And how does this impact U.S. relations with China? Because we do see Vladimir Putin's pivot eastward to China. We do see increased collaboration between Russia and China, although we don't see, right, at least I don't believe we have seen any evidence of Chinese military supplies to Russia yet. And I'm not entirely certain China wants Russia to succeed, but China probably also doesn't want Russia to miserably fail. So how does that impact our relationship? And as they become closer and closer, it seems, is there a way to drive a wedge between those two powers? And I will let you guys sort it out as to who wants to tackle that one first.
Senator, if you, I'll give you the second mover advantage on this one, and I can jump in. I mean, clearly it's, I think, troubling to the United States to see the tightening of the relationship between Russia and China. And as you had sort of stated, Dmitry, I mean, I don't think it is to some extent Russia's advantage. I think this is a marriage of convenience, and they have found themselves in a conflict that exceeded their wildest expectations about how this was going to go. And now they're shipping a tremendous amount of gold over to China to evade the sanctions that have been imposed on them by the West, to gain the materials they need. They are being forced to adopt sort of a renminbi-based system for oil exports, as I understand it, right? The ruble has really deteriorated. And my sort of read on this, not, particularly well informed with any, particular insight, but I am sure that China is totally fine with Russia exhausting itself in a protracted war against Ukraine, which also then ties up the resources of the NATO-aligned countries, right? It is, and to some extent, China wants to have their cake and eat it too. They are publicly sort of offering very weak statements in favor of a ceasefire and a resolution to the conflict, and then they are doing everything counter to that behind the scenes to make sure that the conflict continues. That also sort of makes me wonder, challenges to me their willingness to step up and be a global leader here, and that they frequently do these types of things where they, want to sow discord in private and then have very weak proclamations of seeking peace in public. I think for them, having a Russia that is reliant upon them is to their advantage. Not only does it, increase their access to energy markets that they need, particularly with their vociferous need for raw materials, right? But it is yet another state and a major economy, globally that they can be aligned with. And so I think that for them, this is not a terrible situation to be in. If Russia loses, they can be okay. If Russia wins, they're in an even better position, but it's kind of a no-lose situation for them unless the Western countries can really band together to, put some pressure on China. But I'm not sure what that looks like given the other structural incentives for cooperation through trade, monetary politics, and, the issue of Taiwan. I mean, there may be some trade-off here where they say, well, if you leave Taiwan alone, we'll give you more, autonomy here with respect to Russia and Ukraine. So I think it is a very difficult situation for states outside of the region to navigate, and for the United States to figure out how do we confront someone in the model, right, that the senator offered here of cooperation that doesn't evolve into conflict. There's a real risk here if we are too direct against Russia and by extension against China, that we could elicit the conflict we're seeking to avoid. The problem then becomes Russia and Ukraine essentially become some version of a proxy war between the United States and the NATO countries and China, with each of us supplying material resources, at least in the form of financial resources, tradable goods, and things like this, and in the case of NATO, armaments to the various parties, which extends a conflict in the region.
So now, Dmitry, let me just first make a comment. Since I saw you around the lake 2 years ago, you've gotten a lot more gray hair. So just let me say that Arizona's not going well with you, brother. But we had some really good conversations. I really enjoyed it. And you'll probably have a better sense of this, but it's my impression that Russia's becoming a vassal state of China. and that it has become, as China once was, to you kind of big brother, little brother relationship, that now it is effectively dependent upon China, and therefore it has to give more away. Recently, China issued maps in which it begins to claim areas of the border that have previously been in dispute, and now China is claiming them, and Russia is not complaining, which formerly they would have. So you see this happening. Could we imagine 20 years from now that China tries to take back Manchuria? I can imagine that. And that Russia will be so weakened because of their own demographic crisis, they can do nothing about it. So could this, by the way, let me first say also then about Xi Jinping's attitude towards Russia. When I was with my fellow senators speaking to Xi Jinping, and our audience was 80 minutes, it was raised, what can China do to help bring about a conclusion to the conflict, Russia-Ukraine? And Xi Jinping said, I don't think Russia is ready for that yet. Or I put it more forcefully, Russia is not willing. So it suggests, to the degree that you accept that, is that yes, they have influence, but they cannot yet say, stop, we're not going to give you any more. Now that's important. I think it's also important to note that as best we know, China has not shipped weaponry or weapons to Russia. To do so would invite sanctions from the EU plus the US plus our related allies. And going back to that economic push upon China, they don't want to incur that economic problem. So far, China has not shipped arms. And so I think that then going to the next thing, that the fact that it has been harder for Russia to go into Ukraine, the fact that the West has maintained its commitment and the US has effectively created a coalition of countries supporting Ukraine, has to give the mainland pause as they think about going to Taiwan. Wait a second. The US and its allies are willing to put up. They're willing to sacrifice. They're willing to make it difficult economically for Russia. Do I really want to take that risk if, as I have, as Daniel mentioned earlier, an internal audience of young people who need employment, of an economy which needs to grow in order to have the legitimacy of the PRC, of the CCP, I'm sorry. So I'm hoping that the US and the allies' support of Ukraine is a negative feedback upon whatever designs Xi may have upon Taiwan. Lastly, you ask, how could, I think something along the lines of what could US, I'm writing notes here, what could the US do vis-a-vis Russia? I read an article recently that kind of flipped the script of the opening that Nixon took with Red China. Red China approached us because they needed to triangulate, if you will, vis-a-vis Russia. And they were afraid that Russia, a stronger military power with more advanced nuclear weapons, would attack China, and China would be too weak to stand them. And so they formed an alliance with the United States. And so, if you will, if Russia took on China, they now had to fear the United States. When this settles down, maybe Putin is deposed. Would Russia then want to form an alliance with the West to triangulate against an aggressive CCP, which might be trying to take Manchuria? It makes sense to me. That may seem fantasy given the current state of affairs, but I could see that playing off. I'll put it this way. It's within the realm of possibility that can play.
No, not fantasy at all. I think incredibly possible. And this is the trouble with all autocracies when it comes to war making, right? They often pursue democracies also gain from the rally around the flag effect during wartime, but autocracies engage in this in a lot more complex way, mostly because the autocrat, in this case, Vladimir Putin, the consequences for losing this war are a lot more serious than if a president in a democracy was to lose a war. So, yes, Russia is aligned with China, I would argue, against Russian national interest, ironically, but maybe in Putin's personal interest, because he really has been hungry for some legitimacy. I mean, he made a summit with North Korean dictator into some sort of show of legitimacy for some reason. The idea that post-Putin Russia might pivot to the West as a protection against China is entirely within the realm of possibility, and I really appreciate that comment. I think that's very intuitive, and I think U.S. foreign policy or our grand strategy apparatus should be long-term thinking to account for all of these possibilities. I have a couple of more questions, but I really want to give an audience a chance to ask at least one or two. So I'm going to just read a couple of questions, and you guys maybe can tackle one each or however you wish. One question that I thought was kind of interesting, Dylan Fair, one of our audience members says, "Hello, Senator Cassidy. Is communication between the United States and China cordial, hostile, or is it very little communication at all?" And I think this individual is asking sort of, when the communication is actually happening one-to-one, person to person, right? I mean, sort of this, when you're sitting across the table, is it cordial and polite, or is it hostile, or is it tense? I'm assuming that's what this individual is asking, and I thought that was a kind of an interesting question. Another question that was posed to us, if we were to create legislation against greenhouse effect, if we were to create a tariff against greenhouse emissions, effectively increasing the price of Chinese goods, what is the possibility that might be passed on to U.S. consumer? And how sophisticated is the U.S. population to understand the reasoning behind this legislation, or do you think the U.S. consumer would be mostly isolated from the effects of such legislation? So those are the two questions I will ask, and if you guys want to jump in, please feel free.
Well, let me jump, and then I'll say that the meetings went very well. And of course, it's kind of like, I don't know about you guys, but I'm married very happily. And when you have a fight with your wife, it's not like the fight is like over. Okay, we had a big fight, so I love you, let's have dinner. No, typically there's a kind of a cooling off period. And so my hope, and then you begin to communicate, and then you figure out how one or both were kind of in the wrong. Now, we have had some really tense times lately with the Chinese. And my hope is kind of like in any relationship, the one I just described or the one with the Chinese, it begins with beginning to have communication. If you don't communicate, things are going to get worse. Now, it may get worse anyway, but you better start communicating. And so we went there not having great expectations that we were going to walk away with some, immediate thawing, but the fact that we would understand each other a little bit better, and maybe the next meeting would go just a little bit better yet. So I can't promise, but we received very cordially. Our meeting with Xi was supposed to go for 60 minutes. It extended to 80 minutes. We met, and it was a very frank conversation. We asked tough questions, and they gave us tough answers. And so that's all I could ask for, and that's how I regard that. Secondly, as regards the greenhouse gas, I started to type an answer because we've thought about this a lot. I think our foreign pollution fee tremendously helps the United States. One, it will contribute to the reindustrialization which is already occurring. Cheap natural gas, allowing companies to substitute gas for oil or gas for coal and therefore lower their carbon footprint, is giving our country a competitive advantage. Now, China could escape this fee if they wish, but they would have to buy our natural gas, which helps our economy, employs more Americans, to replace their coal. Secondly, they could license the technology that we're using that they are not to further decrease. But let's take the counterfactual. Let's imagine that we do not put in a foreign pollution fee or a CBAM. Europe is. Europe is going to assess a fee based upon carbon intensity for goods going from Asia and any other place to Europe. Imagine that if they have a fee and we don't, then all the excess capacity that China is trying to get rid of is going to come to our country. They're going to dump it someplace, and we're the biggest economy. EU and us are about the same. We're a little bit bigger. So if they can't ship it there and they've got excess capacity, it's coming to us. If we form this unity, carbon club, you can call it, between EU and us, then they'll have a united front. And that united front will keep them from dumping into either place, but further encourage them to lower emissions. Lastly, Louisiana, rising sea levels, has lost more land mass than any other country, any other state in the nation. We've lost land mass due to relative sea level rise. So we have a vested interest in lowering emissions. And so they will lower their emissions. And to reflect that, Louisiana, very red, very fossil fuel oriented, our state legislature unanimously passed a resolution calling for a provision such as foreign pollution fee. It was recently polled in our state, very red state, redder than Arizona, very red state. And when you present to conservative voters that this is something which equalizes trade between the US and China, conservative voters like it. So I think politically it works and economically it works. And by the way, if we don't do it, it's going to economically punish us, knowing what China would do next.
Thank you, Senator Cassidy. Professor Tirone, do you have any final remarks?
Yeah, so if I can just sort of address the second question real quick and then just sort of sum up. Right, I mean, just on the greenhouse gas tax, I mean, I think that one of the important things to keep in mind here, and this is what the senator is sort of saying, that, right, I mean, it's inescapable that tariffs are taxes on consumption, right? And they're paid for by the country that imposes the tariff. But in cases where the tariff is advancing the national interest, there is a long and storied history in political economy that says the cost is justified. Right. I mean, a lot of the question around tariffs is to what end? If the tariffs are simply to protect a domestic interest, industry, to redistribute income from some sectors to another in the minor, in the individual interest of that industry, I think that is where consumers are far less tolerant of it. If you can introduce a tariff that protects the national interest, as it would be in this case, then I think there is an argument to be made that this is actually utility enhancing for the country. And the individual cost that the consumer may bear can be part of the broader welfare of the nation. And this goes back to Friedrich List, Alexander Hamilton, right? I mean, this is not necessarily a new argument. If this is my opportunity, sort of for closing remarks as well, I just first of all, I'd like to say thank you to Professor Nurullayev and again to the senator as well. I've really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you to the audience for your questions. And I think as someone who, and this may surprise friends of mine, considers myself optimistic by nature, right? I mean, what I would like to think is that there's more opportunity here for cooperation, even in a context of, competition, than the discourse around China would allow in domestic American politics. And frankly, I mean, the thing that really has me particularly concerned, moving forward in opposition to sort of my, my inherent optimism here, is just making sure that we play our role correctly, right? In the United States, due to various features of institutional design, we have a lot of policy change between administrations. We have a lot of policy change, right, in midterm elections and things like this. And I think continuity in policy, having a clear policy that has objectives that are achievable, that can be communicated to allies, and are credible to allies moving forward, where we can say, this is what we want to achieve, and it isn't just going to change because there's another election. So I think policy stability, policy clarity is incredibly important. And whatever we need to do, operating within our system to be a partner to our allies and even a partner to our adversaries, although we, of course, will treat them differently, will go a long way to making sure we maintain the peaceful environment that we desire moving forward.
Yes, thank you, Professor Tirone. You gave me a lot of food for thought in terms of, a conversation about continuity of policy. Sounds like you signed yourself up for another discussion panel sometime next year. But I'm about to pass on the opportunity. I'm gonna pass this on to our dean, Gary Packard. But before I do so, I just want to quickly say that there are two individuals. I think thanking the panelists goes without saying. We're so thankful for your time, but I want to say thank you to Ms. Ariella Magrici, who is our communications director, who made a lot of effort to make this panel a huge success, and who worked to attract a good number of sophisticated audience members. And I also want to extend my thanks to Ms. Hannah Barr, who works as a scheduling coordinator for Senator Cassidy, with whom I had the pleasure of working to coordinate this around Senator's schedule. And she has been an absolute highly professional individual and a pleasure to work with. And I really appreciate her efforts on this as well. So with that, I'm going to pass this on to our Dean, Gary Packard.
Thank you, Dmitry, and let me extend my thanks to Senator Cassidy and to Professor Tirone for joining us today. That was an inspiring conversation and an incredibly important conversation and a wonderful kickoff to our series on events that matter today. I'm reminded of attending the United States Air Force's Air and Space Conference earlier this year in September, when the Honorable Frank Kendall, our Secretary of the Air Force, got up and started his remarks as "Good morning, China, China, China," and then went on to mention, I think, China 30 more times in that speech by my count of his transcript. This is certainly an important topic for us to be discussing for our nation, and I appreciate both your willingness to participate, the time you've taken to be with us, and your expert commentary on this issue. Thank you so much. I'll add to Dmitry's thank you for Ariella, for Meredith and Amanda, who also helped with setup for today, and then certainly to Dmitry, who was instrumental in putting this together, along with our Associate Dean for Research, Dr. Nick Gray, who was also very instrumental in putting this series together. For those of you who are online, we hope you will stay and rejoin us for question and answers, but I have instructions of how you can do that. As you've noticed, you cannot interact with us live and in person on the Zoom link, but to access for the community discussion afterwards, we're going to take a short break. We'll reconvene at 15 minutes past the hour in whatever time zone you happen to be sitting in currently, at 15 minutes after the hour. Sign back into this Zoom link. Ariella will work her magic and create an update to the Zoom link. So when you sign back in, it'll be the interactive Brady Bunch panel you're used to seeing for Zoom meetings, so that we can have a community conversation with both live and online people in the college. So if you have a question that was unanswered in the chat, please come back and we'll be happy to address it. But in the meantime, thank you again to our panelists and for everyone who participated today. So I will sign us off now, and everyone have a wonderful day if you're not coming back. Thank you. Bye-bye.